All right, welcome everyone to this week's Xojo webinar. I'm Paul Lefevre, the Xojo developer evangelist, and this week you won't really get to hear me talk too much. Probably that's good because I'm already stumbling over my words. But I have a special guest this week. I'm very pleased to have FileMaker expert Tim Dietrich, who is going to be talking to you a little bit about how you can use Xojo to work with FileMaker apps. So Tim, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thanks, Paul, and I want to thank you and the entire team at Xojo for making this possible and having me here today. First, let me talk a little bit about who I am and what I do. I'm currently working as a developer evangelist, so there's two of us on one webinar. I'm the developer evangelist for a company called Airtable. It's a sort of database for everyone, and it's a kind of an interesting database that's kind of hidden behind a spreadsheet-like interface. And you can check it out at airtable.com, or there's links to it from my own website as well. So I also run a mobile app development company, and I've got the word stealth in there. It's a service that I provide that I'm not really advertising yet, but I've got a couple of clients that I'm building some rather large mobile apps for. And previously, I worked as a FileMaker developer and consultant, and I think a lot of you who are coming from the FileMaker world sort of know me as the developer behind a lot of the open source projects like EasySync. And more recently, over the weekend, I released a project called FMFoo, which lets you combine or integrate Wufoo forms with FileMaker databases. And I'm also the author of the FileMaker Absolute Beginner Guide, which is available on Amazon. And if you want to learn more about me, my website is timdietrich.me. So enough of that. So I thought I'd start off by talking about why I became interested in mobile apps, and specifically native mobile apps. I was starting to see over the past few years, really, clients requesting native mobile apps. A lot of those people they either have ideas for products or sort of software as a service type businesses. I was also interested in developing some native apps of my own, and so that sort of got me going in terms of looking into how to develop native mobile apps. And I think another reason for being interested in them is that mobile is kind of where the action is. And I've got two links there on that slide. One is a talk that Benedict Evans gave. And if you get a chance, I highly recommend that you check that out. He's got some pretty amazing statistics on where mobile is and where it's going. And then another link there from I think it's actually a slide deck that Jonathan Stark provided for a talk that he gave about the future of mobile. So those are two really good resources to check out if you're interested in mobile and if you need convincing that that is where the action is. So, one of the questions I get when I talk about mobile apps is, why not just use FileMaker Go? And there's a couple of reasons. First, I am a pretty big fan of FileMaker Go. I think it's a fantastic product. It's a great way to make a FileMaker solution that runs on iOS. But there are some limitations, and there's a couple that I have listed there. The big one being that FileMaker Go solutions cannot be distributed on the App Store. FileMaker Go is the app, and essentially your database sort of sits on top of it. So it's not something that you can distribute on the App Store, and that sort of makes it difficult for selling the solution, and also that sort of software as a service model, if that's what you're going for. But another challenge with FileMaker Go is that it does require concurrent connections for solutions that are connecting to a hosted database. And as a result, that increases your cost because you do need to pay for the number of concurrent connections that your server is going to support. And it also sort of decreases your ability to scale. Right now, FileMaker Server can handle up to 100 concurrent connections. So beyond that, your users are going to run into problems. That may be okay in some cases, but I think in a lot of cases where it's a public-facing app, you really can't afford to sort of roll the dice. So those are the limitations of FileMaker Go, and native apps kind of address that. With a native app, you can distribute them on the App Store. And as I'm going to show you today, you can connect native apps to FileMaker databases using custom web publishing, so there's no need for concurrent connections. This reduces the cost, obviously, and then it also allows you to scale up. So you can scale up to, in theory, 2,000 simultaneous connections. So, you know, again, I think native apps kind of address the concerns that we have with Go. So then that sort of leads to the question, well, if you're not using Go, then why bother using FileMaker Server as your backend database? And there's two reasons for that. One, if you can continue to use FileMaker Server, that lets you leverage all the investments that you've made in the platform in terms of infrastructure, your experience and expertise. But I think the sort of bigger issue there is that you already probably have a lot of data stored in FileMaker databases. So if you don't need to get it out, then that sort of saves you a lot of work. So then the question that I get is, well, why Xojo? And I talked a lot about this on my blog, about the journey that I went through to sort of look at and choose a development tool. I ended up looking at Xojo, LiveCode, Swift, PhoneGap, and ultimately I came back to Xojo. And the reason is that Xojo is the one that sort of clicked for me. It has a really nicely designed IDE, as I'm going to show you. The language is powerful. It's very well documented. I think it's easy to read and understand, whereas some of the other languages, in particular LiveCode, are a little strange, I guess. I found that the development workflow for Xojo, especially when it comes to its frameworks, and just the overall method with which you develop apps with Xojo, was very logical. It just sort of made sense to me. And I found that you could very rapidly develop apps with Xojo. That was something that, coming from the FileMaker world where we can quickly create solutions, I was looking for something like that in terms of being able to quickly develop iOS apps. So the other thing that sort of was a plus for Xojo is that it does support a number of targets, meaning that you can compile and create apps for a lot of different operating systems, including Mac, OS X, Windows, Linux, iOS, and it also has the ability to create web applications. I also found that the Xojo developer community is very strong. It's very welcoming and helpful. If you go to forum.xojo.com, I think you can sort of browse it yourself without signing up for an account. And you'll see that there's a lot of people contributing to the community. And it's a great place to go to get advice, ask questions, and so on. And then I guess one more note there. I was also encouraged to look at Xojo by a friend of mine, fellow FileMaker developer Hal Gumbert of Camp Software. He's been using Xojo for years to develop apps, not only for Mac and Windows, but more recently for iOS. And I believe he had one of the very first Xojo developed iOS apps that made it onto the App Store. And it is called Reference for FileMaker, sort of an iOS-based reference tool for looking up functions and error codes and a bunch of other things. If you go to campsoftware.com, you can check it out. Just click under products and you should see it. So what I'm going to try to do today, and I'm going to try to do it quickly so that we don't run on and on and on, is I'm going to give you a quick tour of Xojo, particularly the IDE. I'm going to show you what's involved in creating a basic iOS app that pulls data from FileMaker. And then we'll answer any questions that you have, time permitting. So before I get into the actual demo, I want to talk just a little bit about what's involved in creating the kind of app that you're going to see me demonstrate today. And that is this sort of three-tier architecture. And as you can see on the screen here, I've got an image that shows what that means. I'm going to start really, I guess, at the bottom and work my way up. But the bottom tier is where the data resides. In other words, the information stored in the database. In our example today, that is a FileMaker database that's hosted with FileMaker Server. So I'll sort of jump around a little bit and talk about the top tier, the presentation tier. That's the actual application or system that users are really interacting with. And in our case here, it's an iOS app that we're going to develop with Xojo. And then the logic tier is sort of what pulls those two things together. It's sort of the glue that holds the presentation tier and data tier together. In our case here, and I'll show you in just a moment, that is a web service or API. And essentially what happens is that requests get sent from the presentation tier. They go through the API, the API interacts with the database, gets some data back, and then sends it back to the iOS app. And I'll show you all that in just a moment. This concept is a little different than what we're used to in the FileMaker world, where typically we've got something like FileMaker Pro or Go connecting directly to FileMaker Server. And in this example, that's not how we're doing it. We're actually going to go through an API. That way we can transform the data and handle things like security and all that good stuff. And so I'll show you that in just a moment. And there's a good quote there on the screen from Jonathan Stark's talk, the one I mentioned earlier. And he kind of mentions that he kind of looks at the API as being the app itself because it is so important. So if you get a chance, check that out. And again, you'll find that in his slide deck. And so with that all being said, I'll sort of move on to the demo. All right, so I'm going to start by showing you the FileMaker database itself. And for this example that we're going to go through today for the demo, the use case is just that we have this business network, this imaginary business network, and the group wants to make an iOS app so that people can easily look up or find businesses that belong to that network. So as you can see, I've got a really basic, very flat FileMaker database here. Just kind of show you what it looks like under the hood. There's not much to it. It's just one table with a bunch of fields in it. I do have a container field with a couple of images. I'll sort of browse through some of the records here. Nothing particularly exciting about the database itself. And I did that deliberately just to kind of keep it simple, but I think you'll get the idea. So there is essentially our back end. If you go back to that slide, this would be the data tier. So next, let me show you what the API looks like. So in this case, what I've done, if I can find the right screen here, jump back over, there we go. I have an API that is hosted on a web server, and it's something that I put together. It's something called FM Simple API. It is just a PHP solution that provides a RESTful API server for FileMaker. It's something that's extremely modular and easy to use. I have not released this yet as an open source solution, but if there's enough interest in it, I just might do that. But basically, this is our API. This is the source code. I'm not going to go into great depth here or anything, but again, it's very modular. It handles containers. In this particular case, I've got it wired up to handle calls going through to the members in that FileMaker database. It handles validation. It packages up the response coming in or going back out to the caller. So again, it's a PHP-based API. And then to just kind of show you what that looks like, I am actually going to use an application I started using last week called Paul. It's a REST client for Mac. And it's a really great tool if you are doing any kind of work with APIs, whether you're trying to consume them or develop them. Let me show you what that looks like. Maybe I can get to the right screen. So this is it. This is Paul. And so my API is actually, its endpoint is actually up there. That's the URL to my sort of demo API. And the nice thing about Paul is that it lets me send different types of HTTP requests. In this case, I'm just going to send a GET request and basically tell the API that I want a list of all the members that are active. Let me run it. And I know you couldn't see it or hear it, but it dings for me and it tells me that the data or the response was okay. And this is actually the response. Let me just clear it real quick. And I'll run it again so you can see it come in. Maybe. There it goes. Right, so I'm going to run it again. I'm basically going to send this request to the API so that you can see what the data looks like. And there it is. So what my API is doing is actually taking the XML formatted response that it gets from FileMaker Server, transforms it into JSON, a JSON encoded format response, and this is the result. So if I sort of poke around in here, there's the result set. Here's one of the first records with all of its fields. And for example, the company name is ABC Investments on the first record. On the second record, the name is Acme Transportation. And if I jump back over to the FileMaker database, bear with me for a minute, got all kind of screens blocking my clicks. There's the FileMaker database, and sure enough, there's Acme. If I were to kind of browse through this and show you the results, all the results in Paul, you'd see that they do match. So this is just a great tool, again, for testing out your API, or maybe it's an API that somebody else has provided. This is a great way for you to kind of get a feel for what the calls need to look like and what the responses are going to look like coming back. So this is what Xojo is going to end up getting back into the app itself. So now let's move on to Xojo. So I'm going to go over to Xojo and shrink that down first. I'm going to start by showing you just a really basic new project, an iOS project. When I start a new project with Xojo, I can choose which targets, types of targets I want to develop for. So as you can see, I can develop for desktop, web. You can develop console apps. But I'm going to focus on iOS here. I'm just going to give my application a name, and I'll give it the sort of standard hello world application. So this is what Xojo looks like. This is the IDE. And down the, or on the right, or the top rather, is the toolbar with things like the run command, the ability to sort of change the workspace itself. This sort of work area is broken into 3 columns, the left side being the contents or resources that make up your project. Here's a preview of what the application actually looks like. And then down the right-hand side, I can either choose between the library or the inspector. And so I am going to put together just a real quick hello world type app for you, and then sort of show you how that works. So you can sort of think of an iOS app in Xojo as kind of having multiple screens, and you can think of the views that Xojo uses as almost being FileMaker layouts. So in much the same way that I would put objects on a FileMaker layout, I'm going to do the same thing in this Xojo app. So let me sort of start at the top. So the very first object in the project is the app itself. And you can see that I can choose a bunch of different things here, but in particular, I can choose what screen I want to load for the iPhone, which one to load for iPad. You can actually develop both applications, both for iPhone and iPad in the same project. If I actually click on the screens themselves, this is where I can actually choose what view I want to load when the app runs and it's running on an iPhone. So in this case, it's going to load view 1. Again, kind of think of that as a layout. And in this case, the iPad is going to do the same thing. I'm not going to actually develop for iPad today, but you get the idea. I could have a separate view or layout to take a better advantage, actually, of the iPad's real estate if I wanted. So view 1 is a layout. Think of it again as a FileMaker layout. And I'm actually going to drag on some objects. So for example, I'm going to bring over a text label and resize it. And I'll switch to the inspector. And again, we'll just make this sort of a typical hello world type of application. So the text for that label, I'm going to change it to be hello world. And I'll center it. You can also mess around with the color if you'd like, make it blue. And there you go. Let me actually run it just so that you can see that it really does work. Now, when I run the iOS app in Xojo, it's going to actually fire up the iOS simulator that comes with Xcode. And so let me show you what that looks like. So you can think of this as a program that is simulating, in this case, an iPhone, and in particular an iPhone 4S. I could change the device if I wanted to one of Apple's other devices. But for now, let's just leave it as the 4S. So there's our Hello World app. Nothing particularly exciting about it, but you get the idea, I think. I'm going to jump back over to Xojo, and I'm going to stop the simulator from running. So I'm just going to click stop here. And let me add one more control just so that you can see sort of how Xojo works from a sort of object-oriented and event-based language. So I'm going to add another library or another object from the library. And in this case, I'm going to add a button. Let me resize it a little. Make it nice and wide. I'm going to change its caption. Just make it respond. And so I've added a button to the view. And what I want to do now is when the button's clicked, I want something to happen. So if you think about this in terms of FileMaker, it's just sort of like saying that you want a script trigger to fire when this event happens. In this case, when the button is clicked, I want the event to happen. So I'm going to right click on the button itself. I can do that over here or here. And I can add to button an event handler. And in this case, I want an action. So that when the button is pressed or tapped or clicked, I want this particular event to fire. So this is where I can actually start to write some Xojo code. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it so that when the user clicks that button, that the label that said hello world maybe changes to something else. So let's see what that would look like. I'm going to start to type here, and notice that Xojo auto completes for me. It's smart enough to know the names of the controls that I'm dealing with. I'm just going to tab to let that auto-complete. I put a period, and then if I hit tab, I can see all of the objects or the methods and attributes of that object, rather, that are available for the label that I'm sort of working with here. So I'm going to choose the text. I'm going to have it say, hello back at you. And if I run the simulator again, the app loads up. If I click the respond button, notice that the text has changed to hello back at you. So that is a really, really quick hello world demo of Xojo. I think it kind of shows you a little bit about the environment, how you work with the different tools, the libraries, how you drag things on, and so forth. I'm not going to get too deep into that right now, but again, that's sort of a 30-second demo, I guess, of Xojo itself. So I'll shut that down. So now let me show you the actual demo for today. So this is a demo that, again, it's an iOS app that interacts with a FileMaker database. And I think probably the best way to kind of get this started is just to run it, and then I'll sort of come back to Xojo and show you how it all works. So just like before, I'm going to run the project. So if I can get the screen to go away here, see if I can do it. There we go. So I'm running this other project, and there it is. Now there's not much to look at here. I'm not going for, you know, a design award or anything like that. Really more functionality and just sort of a demonstration of what is possible here. But I think you get the idea. This member information is coming right out of FileMaker. And just to sort of prove that to you, I'll jump back over to FileMaker, and let me sort of sort these. So the first one, I sorted them alphabetically, is ABC Investments, Acme. There's an art studio, and if I jump back over to the app, you can see that there they are. And I do have the API set up so that only active members make their way back into the iOS app. So if I were to take one of these, like let's take Acme and disable it, I'll make it an inactive member. If I jump back over to the iOS app and refresh, you can see that Acme is no longer in the list. So it is real time as far as the changes being made and being reflected over in the iOS app. So let me set that back to active and refresh again. So this is just a list view of the members coming out of that database. And if I were to click on one of these, I go into sort of a more detailed view of that member with contact information and a description. Again, not a lot in terms of design here, but just kind of showing you that the data is making its way out of the database through the API and to the iOS app. So let's jump back over to Xojo, and I'll show you how all that works. So I'm going to stop the simulator. And so this is very much like the Hello World app that you saw just a few moments ago. I have the same types of objects. I've just sort of grouped them a little bit differently here. I like to organize things a little bit differently than how Xojo does right out of the box. But here's my app object itself. Just like before, you can see I've got the options for different screens. I actually have a method here too. You can kind of think of this, think of a method at the app level as almost being like a script in FileMaker. I can call this method and have it do something for me just about anywhere in the app itself. I guess really it's more like a custom function than a script, but it really depends on what your method is, and what it does. In this case, you'll see in a few minutes, it's a method that I use to load an image from a URL into an image on one of the views. So I've also got some notes about the app, which is nice. It lets you sort of document your solution right in the app. And then a couple of properties that are sort of at the app level as well. Again, thinking in terms of FileMaker terminology, these are almost like global fields. These are variables or values that I'm setting that I can refer to all throughout the app. So that's the app object itself. And again, as you saw in the other Hello World app, there are two screens, one for the iPad and one for the iPhone. We're going to focus specifically on the iPhone today, but that's what it looks like. And then the views that I used to actually make the app run, there's a list view, and there it is. And it just has a couple of controls on it. It actually has a table, which is what the data gets loaded into. It has a refresh button, sort of refresh the data if you want to refresh it without having to close and reopen the app. And then there's a progress wheel, which you'll see spin up when I refresh the app. Sometimes it refreshes so fast that you never really get a chance to see the progress wheel, but it's kind of neat when you do see it. So there it is. Let's talk about event handlers. So what happens is the app loads. iOS determines that we are, in our example, running on an iPhone. This list view gets loaded. And then there's an event handler on the list view itself, an open event handler that fires when the list view is loaded. And so this is what the code looks like for this particular event. One of the first things I do is I display that progress wheel that I mentioned before. And again, sometimes it's so fast you can't see it. But then one of the other things I do, and this is where things get interesting, is I create an HTTP socket object, which you can think of as sort of a connection back to the API. This is an instance of a class that I have down here, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But again, it's a socket object, an HTTP socket object, and I create it. I then tell it a little bit about the view that it's running on. I don't want to get too deep into why I have to do that. It's kind of strange, but there you go. I then set some attributes of the request itself. In this particular case, I'm telling the HTTP socket that for authorization, I want to use my API key. And if you remember, that was one of the properties up here at the app level. So the nice thing about that, and the reason that I do it, is that if I decide later on that I'm going to move the API somewhere else, I don't need to go fishing around through the app and changing it everywhere. I can just change it in one place, change it over here, and then it'll instantly be used all throughout my app. Again, this is kind of a basic app, but in an app where you're making a lot of calls to the API, it's kind of nice to have this all in one place. So again, the view loads, we create the object, the HTTP socket object, we set these attributes, and then we tell the HTTP socket object to go ahead and send a GET request to the API. So again, that's very similar to what you saw me do over here in Paul. So what's going to happen is Xojo, or the app rather, is going to send that request to the API, and then the object itself is just going to wait then to get the data back. So let me show you what that class looks like. This is what that socket object is, how it's created and what it's capable of. And just like the views that you saw before and some of the controls, the socket object itself has event handlers. Things like what to do if an error occurs or when a file is received. In our case, we want an event to fire when the data comes back from the API. So that is the page received event handler. And this might look a little bit overwhelming, took a little bit of time for me to sort of wrap my head around how Xojo handles dictionaries and arrays and a bunch of different things. I'm not going to get into that too much today, but essentially what this code does is it takes the data that has been sent back down from the API and it parses it and it loads it into that table on the view. So it's sort of looping over the records that it's received and evaluating them, setting the name and the detailed text, which is that sort of smaller text that you see under each of the company names. And it does that until it's finished loading all the data. And then it turns off, at the very bottom, it turns off the progress wheel. So again, let's run the app real quick so I can show you that. So here's the HTTP request going out. I don't know if you saw it, but the progress wheel was spinning there for a second. And there's the data being loaded. There's the name, and then that sort of short description for each company. So, so that's, again, how I'm loading the data into the table. And then I remember, too, that if I click on one of these rows in the table, it loads the details for the record that I clicked on. So let's take a real quick look at how that happens. So if I go back and look at the list view, there is, again, a table object, or control rather, on the view, and it also has an action. In this case, when somebody clicks on the table, we create a new instance of a detail view, which I'll show you in just a second. And then I pass a couple of things to that view. Basically, I'm going to send over to the detail view all the information that I have about the record that is in that particular row, or that was used to create that row in the table. And then I push to, or load, that detail view. So let's look at what the detail view looks like. And there it is. I've got a bunch of different text labels here, iOS labels. Here's a text field, and then an image object as well. And so what happens is, eventually this view loads, and there's an event that fires when it loads, when it becomes active. And very much like what you saw me do when the data comes in from the API to create the list view, I have similar code that I'm using to sort of take what the list view has sent to the detail view, and I parse it all out and load up all the controls that make up the detail view. Everything from the member name and phone number, URL, details, and even the image. So the image is kind of interesting. Again, I mentioned that there was a method up here called load image from URL. And if I go back to my activate event handler, there is some code in here that will actually handle that as well. It's actually right down here. So I actually am using the API that I developed to request the image that's back in FileMaker, and I load it into this image view. So let's run it one more time. You see how that happened. So again, there's the image, and it is coming directly out of the database. If I were to cut this, I'll go back and refresh the data. And now click on Acme. Notice the image is gone. So again, even the images are coming directly out of FileMaker, out of container fields, and being published in the app itself. So the last thing I want to show you is this refresh button, which you've seen me click a few times. Let's take a look at how that works. So I'm going to stop the simulator. So that refresh button is actually a control on the list view. It's right here. And it has an action, just like you saw me create the button in the Hello World app. This button on the demo app has an action. And basically what happens is when the person clicks that button, I show the progress wheel. I first clear all of the data out of the table, and then I send that exact same request that you saw me send when the list view initially loads. I just send it again. Basically, I'm asking for the API to give me back fresh data. So let's jump back over and look at that one more time. So here it's loading the data for the first time. If I refresh, it's doing it. If I jump back over to FileMaker, I'll turn off or disable a couple of these guys. And if I reload the data, you should see that reflected right there. So that's what the refresh button does. It's essentially using the exact same code for the most part as what fires when the list view loads. So the only real difference is that I have to clear out the data that's already in the table before loading the fresh data back in. So there's a bunch of other event handlers that the socket object can handle. So for example, I mentioned that errors and pages received. We're not using any of those here. I don't have any sophisticated error handling, and I'm not doing anything with files where I'm pushing them up or pulling them down through the socket. But you certainly could, and you could add code to all those handlers as well. So that is the HTTP socket class. Again, we have the list and detail views, screens for iPad and iPhone, and just to kind of give you a preview or an idea of what Xojo is capable of in terms of the iPad, I could resize or change the view that's being used so that it stretches automatically for iPads, and do all kinds of crazy things there to basically make a universal app that runs on iPad and iPhone. It's really easy to do with Xojo. And again, here's all my app level objects and content and so forth. So there you go. There's a Xojo iOS app. Again, very basic, but I think it shows you what's possible with both FileMaker and Xojo. So let me jump back over to Keynote. So there's a bunch of things that I didn't cover. I don't want this to end up being an epic presentation, but some of the things I didn't talk about that are completely doable and possible. Optimizations, so for example, caching and sync. If I wanted to make the app perform better, I could do that. I could cache the data. I could sync it back and forth with the hosted data. I'm not showing in this example how you write data back to the database, but you certainly could. So you could have the app not only being used to publish data or retrieve data, but you could have it be used to collect data and push it back to the hosted database through the API. Again, I didn't show you the iPad support too much, but it's very easy to do. And I'm not taking this all the way to submitting it to the App Store. Paul has a great video that he's recorded in the past about how to get your iOS app into the App Store. So highly recommend that you check it out. So next steps, some suggestions for those of you that want to pursue Xojo. Go ahead and download it. It's free to download and try. I think Paul can talk a little bit about that and tell you what's involved. Highly recommend watching his videos. If you go to xojo.com/support, there's a video library there with a lot of videos, not only on iOS, but on Xojo in general. And then just have fun with it, experiment with Xojo. That's kind of how I got started with it. Sort of did the, well, I wonder if I can do this type of thing. And the next thing you know, I'm creating all these crazy and neat little iOS apps. So I think you'll enjoy Xojo. And I think that brings us to Q&A. Before I take the questions, I did want to mention that we have another Xojo webinar coming up. It's actually on August 18th. And that one's going to be very much like this one, in that we will talk about how you can use Xojo to create iOS apps that instead of talking back to FileMaker, they talk back to Airtable. That's the technology I mentioned at the beginning of the slide. So again, check that out at airtable.com. And if you're interested in signing up for that webinar, there's a link to it. I know there's one on the Xojo site, and there's also a link to it from my website as well. It's, again, August 18th, I think at 1 p.m. Eastern. So let me kick out of Evernote so I can look at the questions. Let's see. Okay, so one of the questions Todd asked is why use Xojo compared to straight Objective-C? That's a great question, and I guess for me, I do not know Objective-C. I do know some Swift, but Xojo for me was much easier to kind of get started with as far as building iOS apps goes. I think for people who are specifically coming from things like FileMaker, Xojo is a great way to sort of get up to speed with developing apps, not only for iOS, but for Mac, Windows, Linux. And again, they've got an interesting web solution as well. So I think it's just easier for you to make the jump to developing with Xojo than it is Objective-C. Can I recommend, Kent is asking, can I recommend a good book as far as a good intro to PHP goes? Well, there's a lot of them. If you're a FileMaker developer looking for information on PHP, I highly recommend Jonathan Stark's book. It's a little bit dated right now. I think it talks about FileMaker, 9, but it's information about PHP and how PHP interacts with FileMaker is just as relevant now as it was when he initially wrote it. That was sort of my Bible back when I was learning PHP and trying to figure out how to tie it into FileMaker. So highly recommended. I think it's still available on Amazon. So another question, maybe we get the demo files. It would help us a lot. Yeah, I'll talk to Paul about that. Let me see how that would work out. But yeah, I don't see any reason why we couldn't make some of this available to you guys. So keep a lookout for that. And I guess I'll let Paul figure out how to let everybody know that it's out there. We'll tweet it and all that good stuff. But yeah, I'll try to make the demo files available. Let's see. Any experience dealing with frameworks like core animation via Xojo? Another good question. And Paul, if you are on, I'm going to let you talk a little bit about how you can use declares to extend the Xojo iOS framework.
Yeah, I thought you might send that one to me, Tim. Well, some of that's perhaps a little bit related to the Objective-C question. And one of the big reasons to start with Xojo over the full-blown Apple tool set for creating an iOS app is just Xojo's a lot simpler to get started with. The framework is smaller. We focused on kind of the more important things rather than everything in the kitchen sink that's included with Apple's Cocoa framework. But Xojo is also completely extensible. And there already are a wide variety of open source projects that are adding capabilities to Xojo's iOS support. And I believe there is a core animation project that's out there now. But anyway, if you want to take a look at some of the things that are available, you can head over to our developer site. That's developer.xojo.com. And that has all documentation. All the videos are up there, links to resources such as open source projects, other people's blogs, stuff like that. So definitely take a look at that. But I mean, pretty much anything that you can do in Cocoa, if it's not built into Xojo, you can hook up to it to get access to it.
Okay, great. I think that's all the questions that we have for now. Is there anything else that you have, Paul, or is that it?
Yeah, I don't see any further questions. Like you already mentioned this, but I want to remind everyone that Xojo's free to download and try. You can essentially think of it as an unlimited trial. You don't have to purchase Xojo until you're ready to build something that you want to actually distribute or hand off to friends or whatever, or sell. So you can head over to Xojo.com, download it, play around, make iOS apps or any of the other many types of apps that Xojo can create. If you do want to play around with iOS, you do, of course, need a Mac. But since you're all FileMaker developers, I'm going to presume you already have one. Other than that, Tim put up our email addresses here. I'm paul@xojo.com and timdietrich@me.com. By all means, if we didn't answer a question or if you have something more detailed you want to ask either of us, just shoot us an email. This is recorded and will show up on YouTube later this week. And we will also get Tim's demo projects hooked up as well so you can download them easily. All right, well, everyone's saying thank you. And I want to also thank Tim, our special guest, for doing this presentation. And like he mentioned, next month, Tim is he's my special guest of the summer, I guess. And he's going to be talking about how Xojo works with Airtable. And in between there, of course, other Xojo webinars and a whole backlog of about 60 to 70 Xojo webinars that you can also watch. So thanks, everyone, for attending. Have a great day.